There is a bit of Talmudic wisdom. There was a famous incident when a great intellect, a professor from Odessa, got permission. A Jewish professor actually was granted permission to be on the train to Moscow. Times of great persecution, anti-Semitism and prohibition. So it was a very special event. He gets on the train in Odessa, and the second stop before the long journey to Moscow, a gentleman gets on and sits in the empty seat next to him. So he figures out, hold on a second, we're in the middle of peasant territory. This is a farming area, and this fellow doesn't look like a peasant, so he must be Jewish. But he's Jewish. How did he get permission? Well, he couldn't be going to Moscow because they gave me permission. It took years to get it. So a Jewish fellow not going to Moscow, where could he be going? I know. Just outside Moscow, there's a little town. The train stops beforehand. It's called Samvet. If it's in Samvet, well, who could he be going to visit in Samvet? There are only two Jewish families, the Bernsteins and the Steenbergs. The Bernsteins, it must be the Steenbergs. Why would he be going to visit the Steenbergs? They've got two daughters, Sarah and Esther. Sarah married a lovely guy from Budapest. Esther, some local businessman. He must be the guy from Budapest. Wasn't it Alexander Cohen? Yeah, but he would have changed his name to something Cohen. Must be Kovacs. Kovacs, made a little more Russianized. Yes, must be Kovacs. And he looks at this, he wouldn't be going, he must have a degree of some sort. Must be Dr. Kovacs. Good morning, Mr. Dr. Kovacs, how are you? How did you know my name? It was simple, really. So Talmudic understanding and logic can be very compelling and very instructive and very challenging. But the title of this talk was Ancient Laws in Contemporary Times, Beth Din in Action, and that's in action. London Beth Din in pause action. And some issues about action and basin, perhaps to go through the lens of some of the interesting introductions that I had. Let me introduce it with the following little story, an insight. I mentioned earlier an incident with Rabbi Yankel Galinsky Shlita and the Chazon Ish, Zechani Livrocha. Another incident I heard from Rabbi Yankel Galinsky, who was a great Maggid, a great preacher, a fellow who's very short in stature, great in inspiration. He's been a world power in inspiring the Torah world for close to 60 years now. And all his talks are being brought out in a series of Sforim. And he told me the following incident. He said he once walked into the Chazon Ish of Avram Yeshai Karelitz, the great halachic genius who wrote the compendium Chazon Ish, Vision of Ish Avram Yeshaya, who was the key halachic authority from Vilna, who had moved to the fledgling Bnei Barak, and who negotiated all the halachic issues in the original times of the establishment of the State of Israel, sitting in his winkler, in his corner, learning. He controlled almost the halachic world simply through the mastery of his halachic expertise. And the Chazon Ish, where Rabbi Yankel Galinsky says he one day walked into the Chazon Ish in 1949, he said, 1949, 1950. And he saw a very strange sight. The Chazon Ish was crouched over a table, looking into a Sefer Torah. And he was reading some words and laughing, and reading and laughing. So eventually, Rabbi Yankel was a little bit embarrassed, and he coughed, and finally Chazon Ish looked up. And Rabbi Yankel asked, Rebbe, he says, "Was tut sich da? What's going on? What?" He said, Rabbi Yankel, you weißt was? Do you know what this is? This is a Sefer Torah which has just come now as part of the influx of Jews from Aleppo. It's not the Codex. But this Sefer Torah that I'm looking into is reputed to be over 800 years old. From Aleppo, Halab in Syria, a country which Nebuch has been torn apart. That's a different topic. We wish any innocent human being's suffering should come to an end immediately. And do you know, Rabbi Yankel, Jews in Aleppo have used this Sefer Torah 800 years ago. Every single part of every letter is exactly the same as the Sefer Torah which we were inducted into our Beis HaMedrash last month. And that's why I'm laughing. Because spanning the globe, around the world, wherever we may be, Kulanu b'nei ish echad nachnu, we have one Father in heaven who gave us one Torah. And through that one Torah, we are one people. And when we were at Har Sinai, the precursor, the introduction to the Sinai Endaba, we stood around the mountain in a circle. And we stood as a circle because everybody was united in purpose with a focal point in the middle. One Torah, one revelation, one people. And thus, wherever we are in the world, scattered in disparate parts of the globe, in distant parts of the exile, that Torah unites us. And wherever we are, we're on terra firma, on terra Israelus, terra Yisraelus, on Torah territory. We are all one people in one home. In fact, the Gemara says famously, Miyom shechara beis hamikdash, from the time that the temple was destroyed, Ein lo l'akadosh baruch hu, God only has daled amas shel halacha, the 4 cubits in which Torah is being learnt. Because where there is Torah, when Torah is being learnt from its legitimate source, correctly learnt, every word of Torah is part and parcel of our legacy. And where we are united in Torah, we are united in our spirit. And at that point, there isn't an exile, there is unity. So I've had the privilege, the great schus of having lived in Australia, maybe not that much of a schus, a great experience, but served on the rabbinate in a shul predominantly of Holocaust survivors and their children, and joining the Melbourne Beth Din and working with your own Rabbi Gideon Fox in many endeavors together. I was given the great, enormous privilege of being invited to join the London Beth Din and to see constant interaction, just as a point of clarification, that our Beth Din constantly is in contact with the South African Beth Din, Beth Din in Canada, in Australia, of course, in Melbourne, in Sydney, in Beth Din, all the Beth Dins, Beth Din, not Death Bin, Beth Din, in around Eretz Yisrael, around the world, but discussing the issues and having the same framework of a halacha and being able to see it from different angles has allowed me, particularly, I feel honored and humbled by having a unique perspective, a unique insight into much of the workings of Beth Dins or Beth Din from different angles. I'd like to share perhaps a little bit of my introduction to the Beth Din, and then a couple of cases, halachic issues, and see our Torah perspective and the Havdal and the secular perspective and where we got to, where we get to in halacha. Bit of history, not so long ago, when I was invited to London to join the Beth Din, to check it out, the great and famous Rosh Beth Din, Dayan Shlita, who had been to Melbourne a couple of times, I'd gotten to know, gave me a little bit of a tour of the London Beth Din. And one of the items he showed me, I mentioned this last night in Marashah, one of the items he showed me was Proceedings Book 20a. A Proceedings book is a book in which every event which happens in the Beth Din, which includes every get, every Gerus case, conversion case, every Din Torah, every ruling of a Beth Din, every question of somebody's Jewish status being determined either way, etc., is recorded. By hand. It's been recorded that way for close to 200 years, and we have records going back that length of time. That burial records going back close to 300 years, but this is part of the legacy of every Din Torah and every bit of evidence. So he creaks up, climbs up on a step ladder to the top of one of the shelves and takes down book 20a. He says, have a look at this. An open book 20a. All of them have a big index at the front. This happens to be a smaller volume than the rest. They're very big, slightly crumbling, but very well preserved all the same. I started opening the pages and realized the pages got thin in the middle until I got to a point where the paper was shredded. And there's a indentation, a rip right through the whole series of pages, and the book stops there. Half the pages had been unused. I looked at the note at the side, and it had the details of an event. A get was in process in 1940, in November, in London. And the Beth Din was hit with a direct hit by a bomb during the Blitz. And the note on the side says, it's actually crossed out the details of the get because it was terminated in the middle of the process. One of the witnesses was badly injured and Nishtogedacht passed away later with injuries. The Dayanim of the Beth Din were saved b'derech nes, although the Beth Din room crumbled. Everybody else was saved and spared, except for the book, which is living history to what was going on in those times. Book 21 continues of the get, which continued 2 weeks later. And that gave me a little bit of the sense of the continuum of responsibility. And then, a few weeks later, a few months after I got into the job, in the beginning of 2002, end of 2001, beginning of 2002, we were approached by a young man who, professional in the medical spheres, who on his spare time, had studied chemical weapons. He was an expert in the effect of chemical weapons, biological weapons particularly. And he was joining the British forces in the second round of the Gulf War. He was going to leave London to join their forces, and he was worried that potentially he may be kidnapped or may be missing in action, and his wife would be left as an aguna. So he wanted to make sure, as the Gemara says, the Talmud relates in Ksubis, that all the Chayalei Beis David, those who went out to battle in King David's forces, would actually issue a conditional get, before they left, in case they disappeared and were unaccounted for. Their wives wouldn't be left wandering and left in a state of permanent connection to a husband whose whereabouts they didn't know. So he wanted to do the same. I looked through the files, pulled out the documents which Dayan Abramsky had compiled during the Second World War, updated them for the Gulf War, and gave him. We don't do a get unconditionally, harsho. He came before the Beth Din, he empowered, instructed the witnesses, the scribe, a shliach, on condition, if I haven't been heard from for 12 months by the British Army at any point and they acknowledge it, then my instructions come into place. The whole rigmarole, he went off to war. The good news is he came back safely a couple of months later. The bad news is he did the get 6 months later. A sense of continuum of history. And then we had a case, just an introduction to some of the cases we'll discuss. You had a membership case of a woman who was applying for membership. Never she had outmarried. And clearly she had a child. It was a question of longer term membership for a shul for bar mitzvah, bas mitzvah. That was really the relevance I could see. A membership application which came on my desk. And her Jewish status was proved through her parents. Her mother had a second marriage. And I checked back the records. And her mother had a second marriage to a gentleman. Civil marriage. And I checked, had there been a divorce in the previous marriage. And we found the records of the first marriage being in a United Synagogue Halacha. And there was no record of divorce. Which meant that a second marriage had taken place while halachically the first marriage was still existent. Which meant that the woman who was asking me, halachically, chas v'shalom, could there be a disqualification of a terrible stain of being a mamzeres, not of her own accord, her own volition, and it's heartbreaking. And then her children. And it's one of those most difficult areas of halacha to approach. I searched and searched and discovered that in 1968 a file had been opened. This woman who had been through terrible abuse in the first marriage had been civilly divorced. Sometime later, that husband who had abused her came before the Beth Din, and this woman was no longer interested in a get. The husband subsequently brought evidence that she had civilly married somebody else. So one Dayan in 1968, thank the Lord, did his job. He organized what is known as a get al yadei zikui, which in essence means it's a mechanism by which, in a situation which undoubtedly it is to the benefit of the recipient to receive a get, because The alternative is to be, God forbid, an adulterous marriage, an adulterous union. It can be received derech zechus as a zikui. It's a mechanism used rarely. But when proven that they've entered permanently into another relationship, you can invoke such a process. Baruch Hashem, in 1968, Dayan didn't throw away the file and say, we got no woman to give a get to. Did his homework, made sure get zikui was done, and this woman never knew. She was divorced Halacha in 1968. And because of that, 50 years later, children are going to be from children without any problem of marriage. That's a sense of the continuum and the importance of halachic nuance and taking it seriously. And then just to top it off, when the Beth Din offices moved about 6 years ago, and we all packed up our offices. I found boxes of files, letters written from the Chief Rabbinate of Palestine in 1944 to the Chief Rabbinate in England, trying to get a get from a husband to run off to England and was actually in Wormwood Scrubs jail and is about to be released, and to make sure that they got a get from him first. A letter from the late Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky, who was at the time Rav Toronto, writing letters and communicating in 1945, 46 and 47. And then I found a document which took my breath away and may pay for my retirement package. A document written, a gevias edus, a commitment and testimony of somebody making a declaration for something. None in our Beth Din somehow. We're in 5,773. This was done in 5,548. Handwritten. I'm not going to tell you where it is. It's too valuable to let out of our sight. But at the same halacha, the same text, the same processes, the same concern with every nuance is what carries forward halacha from generation to generation. So that's a little bit of introduction about the importance and gravitas and gravity and maintenance of standards of a Beth Din. If I may just take this opportunity, I can't see who's here entirely exactly, but you have here a wonderful Beis Din. You have a wonderful Av Beis Din and wonderful Dayanim. Exceptional, and it's not for me to be patronizing people who are my seniors in age and maybe in experience, but you should know you have an exceptional Beis Din, not only their commitment, their professionalism and their decency and their correctness, but the reputation they have around the world in the way that they connect with the community. And you can see the partnership they have with the Chief Rabbinate and the organization of the community means they have an excellent operation here for kashrus, for all standards. When I have all the ksubas from various shuls, which come on my desk, and gerus cases, and gittin cases, which are done here, and people move to England and they come particularly on my desk as my responsibility, one of my duties, I rest assured with the confidence and conviction of knowing what a wonderful Beis Din you have and the great work of the rabbinate united around that Beis Din, and long may that continue. To speak about a couple of halachic cases that actually, one will start from an Australian point of view, and you'll see why. In 1884, before my birth, there was an International Meridian Conference held in Washington, in which a discussion ensued, because this was shortly after the time, in 1867, when Alaska had been leased by Russia to the United States. Alaska, being part of Russia, the toe end of Russia, actually was the eastern part of Russia. And the more east you go, the more ahead you are, because the closer to the sun you are, the rising sun, was the earliest time zone in Russia. But the moment across the Bering Straits, they call it in the Hamisher places, the Herring Straits, the Schmalz Herring Straits, when Alaska moved over and became part of America, it became the western part, the westernmost part of America. On the American time zone, it stayed in place. I don't think they towed Alaska anywhere. I think it stayed where it was, and they didn't know about the oil and gas which America are ripping out of the ground at this moment. But it changed from being the leading time zone in Russia to the last time zone 24 hours later in America. What happened to Shabbos then? Suddenly Thursday became Wednesday. When did Shabbos change to? What decided when Shabbos changes? Or Pesach started? Or Yom Kippur? If they'd done it in Yom Kippur, could you have missed out the fast in one go? So this was a discussion. They had to actually establish a dateline. And this conference in 1884 determined that the dateline should be, obviously, the most important part in the world, obviously, is London, Greenwich, yes. But 180 degrees from Greenwich, approximately. But the problem was he went through some of the Pacific Islands. You have a line somewhere zigzagging around the Samoan Islands, almost a zigzag, looks like some shikar has drawn it. That's the dateline, international dateline. Cross it and you've gone from one day to the next. Clearly it has ramifications from a legal point of view. Halachically, is there a dateline? Is there? Is New Zealand ahead of us? Australia ahead of us or behind us? How do we determine it? If you lived in Alaska, would it change according to the sale? And if they sell back Alaska, they suddenly go ahead a day ahead? What determines when Shabbos is? So it became a debate. Without going into too much detail, because it's beyond us at this point, but I'll perhaps preface it with one remark from a Gemara. It's a little bit complex. I think we can all understand it. The Gemara in Rosh Hashanah says, on Daf Chafam at base, that if Kiddush HaChodesh, we know that a new month is declared on the appearance of a new moon. Rosh Chodesh, the beginning of a month, was when the new moon appeared. Today we work out our months not based on testimony. We don't have a central Beth Din. It was put into place by Hillel, put into place the process we have in our calendar today. However, historically, the mitzvah is to be Makadesh, to declare the new month on the appearance of a new moon. The Gemara says that if the new moon appears and the witnesses come before the Beth Din in Yerushalayim, before midday on any particular day, then they can declare that day Rosh Chodesh. But if they came after midday, they can't. It's too late, the next day becomes Rosh Chodesh. The Baal HaMoir, Rabbi Zrachiyahu Halevi, one of the classic commentaries on the Gemara, explains in the following way. He says, the essence of that decision depends on this premise. It doesn't make sense to declare a day Rosh Chodesh if it's only going to be a fragment or part of a day. It must be that at least in one place in the world, there's going to be a full 24 hours which is going to experience that day as a Rosh Chodesh. In Yerushalayim, it's 5 to 12, Cholent time, Shabbos morning. Actually, they daven very early. It's probably 2 hours after Cholent in Yerushalayim. They all daven so early. 5 to 12 Shabbos. If the Eidim have come before 12 o'clock, we can still declare it Rosh Chodesh. You know why? Says the Baal HaMoir, the Gemara is telling us, there is one place in the world where in Yerushalayim it's 5 to 12. There's going to be one place where it's 5 to 6 Friday afternoon. In which case, if we declare it Rosh Chodesh before midday, there will be one place, the whole of Shabbos was Rosh Chodesh. Says the Baal HaMoir, because the world is round, as we all know, way before Christopher Columbus had even set sail and didn't fall off the side of the world. He wrote this in the 1100s. He said, we know the world is round. So every place in the world, you've got 360 degrees. Split the world into 4 quadrants. Yerushalayim is 6 hours behind the beginning of the time zone of where the day begins, which is the end of the Tchilas Hayabeshes, the beginning of the continent of settlement of the Euro-Asian landmass, or just off the eastern tip of China. It's 89.7 degrees ahead. That's where the dateline is. And therefore, Yerushalayim is 6 hours after the beginning of the day. You have a place which is 18 hours behind. That is the pshat in the Gemara, is the intention of the Talmud, and that's where the Jewish dateline is. And he says, if you don't believe me, I'll tell you. He doesn't speak about the Washington Conference, about 800 years beforehand. I'll tell you where it says so. He says, in the first chapter of the Torah, after the first day of creation, Vayikra Elokim, and God declared, called La'or, daylight, Yom, he called it day. V'lachoshech, in the time of darkness, Kara Loila, he called night. Vahi Erev, Vahi Vaiker, it was evening, it was morning. Yom Echod. What does Yom Echod mean? One day. So Rashi asks, why does it say one day? It should be day one, the first day. So Rashi says, no, this alludes to the fact on that day, God was one because nothing else had been created. The oneness was felt. There was a world with nothing in it, so to speak, just God. Ramban Nachmanides says the following. He quotes Maimonides. He says, there's some who say, Vahi Erev, Vahi Vaiker, Yom Echod, one day. Listen to this. Kizer Remez, this indicates the Tnuas HaGalgal, the orbit of the planets, Al Pnei Kol HaOretz, over the whole face of the globe, Ve'esrim Shoyos, in 24 hours. Shekol Rega Mehem, at any given moment, in one place, Boiker, where it is morning, B'mekoymos Mishtanim, in different places, exactly the opposite on that round globe. Ve'erev is evening, B'mekoymos Mishtanim, in the opposite place. Says the Ramban, Vahi Erev, Vahi Vaiker. It was morning or evening and morning simultaneously around the world. Yom Echad, that's how you have one day, because the world is round. There's a beginning and end to a day. It's round, a round globe. There must be a dateline. It's in the first paragraph of the Torah. They were 1884. They were 5,000 years too late. That's how the Baal HaMaor explains our dateline. The only problem is that if you take the dateline as being 90 degrees ahead of Yerushalayim, and it comes down the eastern tip of China, Hong Kong, Japan would be the wrong side of it, but it hits Australia slightly east of Perth. You can chop up Australia and keep going. You'd have Perth would be 6 hours ahead of Yerushalayim, and Melbourne should be 18 hours behind. 17 hours. It's actually 8 hours ahead. Well, you could go from this line, Shabbos, Sunday. Shabbos, Sunday. Could do that. It says the Chazon Ish, it doesn't make sense to split a landmass, and he proves it. You can't split a landmass if part of a landmass is ahead, the whole landmass remains ahead. This is the basis of how the Chazon Ish applied it when the yeshiva from Mir, the Mochrim from Mir who fled through Vladivostok on to Shanghai, China, and they had to know about the question when they came from Japan to China, then on to America, how do they deal with the dateline? He wrote them this tshuva, this famous piece of correspondence, exactly where it was, and he explains Australia as well. Which leads me to a practical example. In 1991, we'd arranged to go with my family, my wife and children from Melbourne, Australia, to visit my late father, my mother and family in London, Motzei Yom Kippur, for Sukkot. The plane which came in from Singapore down to Melbourne, on to Sydney, back to Melbourne, and flew back direction of west through the Far East to England. A couple of hours before Kol Nidre, we got a call. There's a baggage handler strike in Melbourne airport. And therefore, they're not going to bring the plane back as it lands in Melbourne to Sydney and let us pick it up back in Melbourne. We're going to have to catch it as it lands in Melbourne, go out through Sydney, and from there to fly on. Which meant instead of picking up the flight at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, we had to be there 8 o'clock in the morning, get the kids ready, Motzei Yom Kippur, and pack. Okay, that's my wife's problems. Oh, I shouldn't say my problems. Sorry, I've got Gary Newman here. He'd be very angry if I said that. In the event, we got there in time. The plane took off about 8:30 in the morning, flying from Melbourne to Sydney. As we're flying to Sydney, half an hour beforehand, I noticed because of the busy traffic around Sydney Airport, the plane flew over the ocean a little bit, east of Sydney. I turned to my wife and said, hold on. According to the Chazon Ish, according to the Jewish dateline, we've just gone back a day. Yesterday was Yom Kippur. Spit it out, take the shoes off, and do a quick al-chait. And we had a quarter of an hour extra Yom Kippur, specially given to us by the Jewish dateline, brought to you by the Chazon Ish. And that was perfectly consistent halachically. Okay, don't try it at home. Any questions at dateline, New Zealand, there are many questions in Halacha. but just to see the point of analysis straight from a Pasuk, through a Gemara, through the Talmud, through a halachic conclusion of the Talmud, and the way the Rishonim explain it and how it manifests itself in our time, there you have it. I was asked the question, what happens if somebody wants to skip out Yom Kippur by leaving wherever the Jewish dateline is, just before sunset, just before Kol Nidre gets in the plane and goes over the dateline and lands the other side, and he just you jump the dateline with 10 minutes left? In any case. And he says, and gets over the dateline, so he's come to Motzah Ne'ilah. He's missed out Yom Kippur. Technically, you'd be right. But you need a double Yom Kippur to give up and put right such a sin. So don't try it at home. Another question. Many of the issues in a Beth Din relate to Jewish status. And there is a halacha. There is a halachic principle known as Yakir. It's based on a verse in the Torah, which the Torah says in Parshas Kisei. It talks about when a person marries two wives, which was permissible in biblical times, and he has one marriage which doesn't succeed, and yet his oldest son is from that marriage. The Torah says, Ki mesabecher ben asnua Yakir. Whoever is your oldest child, you have to recognize you have no right to favor another child in favor of this child. Ki im esabcher ben hasnua. The firstborn, if he is a firstborn, even if he comes from a marriage which wasn't a successful one, Yakir, recognize him. Lo seisloi pi shnayim, to give him the priority as the laws of the Torah require. Yakir. Our rabbis understood in Torah Sheba'al Peh, in the Gemara, the Mishnah in Kiddushin, Daf Ayin Dalet, the Gemara elaborates in Daf Ayin Ches, the Gemara in Bava Basra, Kuf Chav Zayin, the Gemara in Yevomis, and says the principle of Yakir, if it says that the father is believed to declare this one is the firstborn, it means that even if we presumed another one was the firstborn, he has the right to determine it because it's his right as a father to make that declaration. He's believed. He can't change a status. He's believed to establish a status, even if it means undermining the status of one who we presume till now was the firstborn. What emanates from there, says the Gemara, we see from here that the Torah gives a right to qualify or disqualify the status of a child on the basis of the testimony of a parent. In this case, we're talking about the father. And so it's ruled in Shulchan Aruch. In Even Ezer Siman Dalet, if a father declares about a child, that's my child, but unfortunately the marriage was one which wasn't blessed according to Halacha, I was a Kohen married to a woman who I wasn't allowed to marry, the child becomes a Cholol, can't marry a Kohen, for example. It's called Yakir. And it's a complex area of Halacha, but I had a personal experience which I think is unbelievable, I want to share with you. We had an application to the Beth Din in 2003 from a gentleman called Moiz Hatanyan, born in Iran in 1976. He was slightly actually incapacitated. That's not a reason to hold anything chas v'sholom against him. And he was trying to establish Jewish status. He had a vague idea about Judaism. He'd come to London, broken English, born in 1976 in Iran, had come and he gave us some documents stating that he was Jewish. He left Iran in 1992-93, he claimed, born 21st of September 76. And the story was, his father was a fellow called Musa Kalim, whatever the case is, who'd been Jewish, left Iran in 1988, he disappeared and presumed gone to Iran, to the United States. The way he told me was because his father was an architect and been involved in some construction, which had some criminal charges. He had to flee. He didn't know his father, estranged from his mother. His mother, he presumed, was Jewish and always thought, but his father one who knew more about it, but he didn't know where his father was. And he brought me some documents, and he wanted to be established as a Jew. So it was very difficult to establish. I got his mother on the phone in Tehran. She's still there. And he translated. And he tried time and again. And she never would say she was Jewish. And we discussed it. Okay, there's no proof. Just to get a picture. Not being an expert in these areas, I contacted somebody who I knew in Los Angeles, the son of the last rabbi of Tehran. Big Talmid Chacham. I sent him the papers. Looked into them. He said, I don't know the name, the family name. I can't help you. And the actual papers you show me, I don't think they're reliable. It seems there was some lay person had written up the papers testifying to this boy's Jewish status. I don't know the name. My father's no longer alive. It can't be proven. I've got to tell son whether he's Jewish or not. So a couple of years later, I was trying. I tried the Israeli rabbinate. Finally, I had a conference in Paris in 2004 of a lot of rabbonim together, a lot of rabbis, included the chief rabbis of Israel camp. 300 rabbonim from Europe got together. The chief rabbis from Israel camp, chief rabbis from different parts of the world. And I took the documents with, and I saw the head of the department of the Israeli Sephardi chief rabbi, and I said, do me a favor. Please look into these. I need some help. I need to establish his status. I said, but don't try such and such in Los Angeles. If you're going to, I've checked him out, don't try. A week later, I get a message on my phone from this Rabbi Ben Dayan from Israel. Call this rabbi in Los Angeles, the same person Bad called, to speak to him. Shkoyach. Great shakes, what do you say? Whoopie day, you say in Australia, whoopie day. The only person I told him not to speak to had spoken to. The only helpless path he followed. But he told me, so I called him. I finally got through to this rabbi, and he was breathless. He said, you'll never believe what happened. He said, I received these documents from this Rabbi Ben Dayan, and I remembered that I received them before, but I don't remember, it was something vague. And he said, suddenly I recalled the name of somebody in my shul who's turned up occasionally. So I took the papers to my shul, found out the person's number, and called him up. And I called him and said, do you know anything about a Mois Hatanian? So he says, the phone went quiet. And he said, what do you know about this boy? He said, I've received some documents. Would you perhaps know of the family? Stay right there. He said, half an hour later, this gentleman turns up, as white as a sheet, looks at the documents, and said, that's my son, and he's a Gentile. What was the story? He was a soldier in the Iranian army. He'd been stationed outside Tehran, and he'd met up with a non-Jewish woman. And he went back, released from the army, and gets a note that this woman he'd had a fling with had a child. And he couldn't let it be known, so he did what he could to support that person. And as soon as he could get out, he went to America and established another life. And he was an upstanding, professional member of the community with a fine family. And he had been sending finances through an account for years, not knowing what had happened. And through this needle in a haystack, we'd identified this fellow's father. And I could never tell him that, because I'd break his heart and I'd ruin families. And it wasn't my duty. But Yakir determined, when the person gave testimony in front of rabbis in Los Angeles, this is my son, but he isn't Jewish. Halachically, I'd fulfilled my obligation based on the Shulchan Aruch and the other various spheres of Halacha to confirm his status. And he continued to live in London and was looked after, but not as part of our community. I want to finish off with the following thought. Some of the dynamics and some of the developments and applications of halachic law. I want to talk about piercing the corporate veil and personal responsibility and not using companies to hide behind, which finally they've actually come to acknowledge just last week in a landmark Supreme Court ruling in England. The halachic perspective. I want to speak about the question of Jewish identity and Jewish status depending on biological, if it's egg donation, biological mother, birth mothers, adoption, and all the various surrogacy issues. You've got an expert here, Rabbi Gideon Fox, the leading expert in the world in doing it Halacha. But there's so many issues which just come along the way, which Torah challenges us to follow its path and find clarity. In my shul in Melbourne, amongst the wonderful families we had, there was one request I got for a bar mitzvah from a fellow called Bernard Rothschild. His grandson was due to be bar mitzvah, and he wanted to use a family sefer Torah, which at the time was stationed in a different shul, Melbourne shul, otherwise known as Turak shul. They brought it ahead of the bar mitzvah, and it actually was a strange sefer Torah. It was much taller, it had patches on it, but it was kosher. It was a different sort of ksav, Obviously an old Sefer Torah, but it was kosher as far as I could see, and I was delighted to be able to use it. So it came to the Bar Mitzvah day, and the family are called up, Bar Mitzvah boy's reading, and then Bernard Rothschild himself, a gentleman of the time, in the mid-70s, late 70s, was called up to the Torah. And he starts his aliyah, and an old Yakir background, Baruch Hu es Hashem HaMevaruch, and then he crumbled and started crying away and couldn't continue. Not a good feeling as a young Rov, having somebody who can be your grandfather crying in the middle of shul, and not much you can do about it. And you can't start cheering him up and making faces. So I walked down, put my arm around him, I think. Managed to get through the bracha. His grandson did the laying, and the grandfather continues, makes the bracha afterwards, choked up, and it took him a long time to finish the bracha. Oh, big mazel tov. I asked him to come up afterwards. Vossi de Meise. What are the tears about? And he told me the following. He said, Rabbi, I was bar mitzvah in Mannheim in Germany. From the same Sefer Torah that my father had his bar mitzvah in Mannheim, which my grandfather had before the turn of the last century. He said, when we had to flee, we left in a hurry in 1938. We left in a hurry in 38, early 39 actually. It was before the war. But they weren't allowed to take possessions with, they were allowed to take literally a bag. And he said, the one possession our family took with was a Sefer Torah which we slit, and various members had it either in their bag or around their arms. And that's how we carried it out. We got to Holland, and we had it stitched together. But during the invasion of Holland, all the Sefer Torah were collected and they were put in a vault somewhere. We know it was in the grounds of the famous Spanish and Portuguese shul. Hundreds of Sefer Torah. I came out to gates and the family spread. And he said in the 1970s, I didn't remember about it. Out of the blue in 1985, I get a call. Do you know anything about a Sefer Torah? In the bank, in the vault in the ground in Holland, we're trying to find and own it. It says Rothschild from Mannheim. And he says, the Rebbe, the same Sefer Torah that my grandfather was called up to, my grandson has been called up to in Australia. Through Germany, through Holland, through Gateshead for me, through persecutions now in Melbourne, and he's laying the Sedra. Shouldn't I be crying? And then I started crying. And I spoke at the Bar Mitzvah on the Sunday night. I brought a copy from the Jewish Observer, a front cover picture of American GIs reading the Megillah in Berlin on Purim in 1945. And the picture of a group of GIs reading the Megillah has all around it, unmistakably, swastika flags all around. They had been given by the American forces the Gestapo headquarters to use as a shul so they could read the Megillah. That's our people, and that's our Torah. I feel very emotional, not least because I'm quite tired. But I don't think you realize quite what to me, to us, this means. You're coming together. Can you imagine the grandparents and great-grandparents of all the people here, thousands, Kenai Nahara. Most of them, or a great, huge percentage, from the towns and cities of Lita or Russia, from Malat and Kovna, and Ponovizh, and Vilna, and Slabodka, and from Krinky, and from Bialystok. Can you imagine when they came 100 years ago, they went out into the Veld, and they came with that learning? Can you imagine how they worried what would be to the future of the Torah they'd learnt? Can you imagine 40, 50 years ago in Shemayim, when they were going to their Maker, how they felt about what would be here? Can you think now how they're dancing in Shemayim? Can you imagine the Rakida of South African pioneer generation to see what's going on here? The same Torah, the same Sforim, the same Chumash, the same Gemara. You're here to learn. Thousands of people leading the world in Torah. That's our Sefer Torah through Mannheim in Germany. And that's the power and eternity of our Torah. And if I have the privilege of seeing it, not a based in seeing the continuum of Halacha, but seeing the holiness of communities, and knowing that the Kiruv movement, which has flourished here and has been the envy of the world, is continuing to develop into B'nai Torah for generations. It's such an honor to partake in such an inspirational gathering. Yehi Rotzain, may it be HaKadosh Baruch Hu's will, Shechefetz Hashem b'yedchem yatzliach, that God's desire should be fulfilled through your actions. V'hi noam Hashem Elokeinu aleichem, may God's glory be upon you among us all. And through that, please God, may all of us merit to see our families growing in Torah, our real Torah, our Chumash, our Gemara, our Mishnayos, to develop and strengthen, to see children and grandchildren, Talmidei Chachomim, God-fearing families, and through that have the nachas of knowing that our great-grandparents will celebrate with their great-great-grandchildren in Yerushalayim Habenuyah, in Jerusalem rebuilt, and we'll have true peace, and every Jew from around the world, around that Beis HaMikdash dancing in the celebration of eternal Torah. May that be speeded in all our days. Amen and thank you.